Hello students, welcome to the third year honours Bachelor of Arts program in the subject of history. This is your semester 5 and your paper for semester 5 is World Revolutions, which will be taken by me, Alison Quadros, Assistant Professor in the Department of History. So your first unit is the century of revolutions in England. And the subtopic under this that we will start with today is the Stuarts, James I and Charles I. They are called as the early Stuarts. So now I will just give you an outline of the topic that we will be discussing today. So with regard to the early Stuarts, we have two of them, that is James I and Charles I. So in this topic, we will be discussing the policies and governance of both of these early Stuart rulers, James I and Charles I, and mainly we will be discussing how they behaved with their parliaments. So at the end of this module, you as students would be able to better understand the rule of the early Stuarts in Britain, would analyze the reasons for the discontent of the English nation, as well as comprehend the factors for the revolutionary changes that came later. So let us learn a little bit about the Stuarts first. Now the Stuarts originally were a royal house of Scotland. They were called the Stuarts. The first monarch of the Stewart line was Robert II, and he ruled from 1371. He was the founder. Now the descendants of Robert II basically ruled from 1371 to 1707. So that would be the entire reign of the Stuarts in Scotland. Now, one of the Stuart rulers, Mary, Queen of Scots, as she was called, adopted the French spelling for the name Stuart, and henceforth they were called as Stuarts. So note the change in the spelling. From S-T-E-W-A-R-T-S, Stuarts, they were now called as the Stuarts, S-T-U-A-R-T-S. So now coming to the Stewart period in Britain. If you remember, I said they were a ruling house of Scotland. So they ruled over Scotland as well. But they ruled from 1603 to 1707 in England and Scotland. And it's very important to know that in England, they took over from the Tudors. Now, the founder of the Stuart dynasty in Britain was James I. Formally, he was James VI of Scotland. So when he was ruling over Scotland, he was called as James VI. Now, talking about the Stuart period in Britain, the last ruler of this dynasty was Queen Anne. Altogether, 7 monarchs ruled over Britain. Now, the Stuarts were replaced in Britain by the House of Hanover, which was from Germany. Now, a little bit about the characteristics of this Stuart period in Britain. Now, this period basically saw a flourishing court culture. There was a religious debate during this period coupled with a lot of radical politics. And when I say radical politics, it basically means that this period, and a very important characteristic of this period, was the quarrel between the kings and the parliaments. Now, at this point, I'd like to mention that the Tudors were a little bit different from the Stuarts. Okay, so in this next slide, we will see the Stuarts were basically unwise, blind Catholics. They believed in divine theory of kingship, and very importantly, there was relative peace during their rule. The Tudors, on the other hand, they were neither Protestants nor opposed to Catholicism. They followed a policy of compromise, and the constant danger of foreign attack was there during their rule. So, so we basically can see that the political problems were very different during the time of the Tudors as well as the Stuarts. During the Stuarts, the country did not face the danger of a foreign attack, whereas during the Tudor time, they did face the danger of foreign attack, which was happening all the time, So despotism of the government, which was needed to put down internal disorder and the enemies, was not required during the time of the Stuarts. So they were not despots. Parliament reigned supreme and during the time of the Stuarts, and this is why there was this big clash between the Stuart monarchs and their parliament. Okay, so now coming to the first of the early Stuarts, James I, and as I mentioned earlier, he was the founder of the Stuart dynasty in Britain, formerly known as James VI of Scotland, as I mentioned earlier. So his reign was from 1603 to 1625. Now he was the son of Mary Stuart of Scotland, also known as Mary Queen of Scots, and he began the Stewart period in England by replacing the Tudors, and he is said to have succeeded Queen Elizabeth I, the Tudor monarch, to the throne. And he is the first monarch credited to have ruled over England and Scotland. Ireland was added later, that is in 1612, during his rule itself. Now, James I expounded the theory of the divine right of kings, and this is basically what all the other Stuart monarchs did. He supported something called Episcopacy. Okay, now Episcopacy basically was a rule of the bishops. Okay, he did not even favor Anglicans, Puritans, and even Catholics. He was extremely intolerant of all these others. Okay. And very importantly, the most important characteristic of his rule was his clash with the Parliament. So talking about the parliaments of James I, 4 parliaments basically met during the reign of James I, and all of them questioned the king's interference in their functioning. The first parliament basically met in 1604, and it criticized the king's decisions with regard to diplomatic relations, religious matters, foreign affairs, marriage contracts. Okay, the king in retaliation managed to dissolve 3 of his parliaments who were basically not agreeing with him on several of his decisions. But unfortunately, when the 4th parliament was sitting, he died. Now, James I was succeeded by his son, Charles I. Charles I basically inherited a throne beset with a number of problems, and I said beset with a number of problems is because his father had basically left him a throne that had all of these issues with Parliament, and his father was unable to solve them. So it was now left up to Charles I to deal with all of these problems. However, Charles I, like his father, too espoused the theory of the divine right of kings. He too was contemptuous of Parliament, and he supported Catholics, although he himself at this point had not actually embraced the Catholic faith. Now, his main quarrel also was with Parliament, as was seen during the time of his. So now let us look at the parliaments of Charles I. Now, the first 2 parliaments of Charles I met in 1625, but as was the case with all of these early Stuart monarchs, the king had difference of opinion with these 2 parliaments and dissolved them over these differences of opinion. The 3rd parliament was summoned by him in 1628. This too was dissolved over the question of fighting a war with Spain, which the parliament did not agree to. The king thereafter ruled for 11 years without convening Parliament because he did not want them to overrule his decisions or not allow him to take decisions with regard to anything. However, he was forced to convene Parliament in 1640 over a rebellion that had taken place in Scotland. It was a rebellion of some bishops. This Parliament, however, met for just 3 weeks, and therefore it was termed as the Short Parliament. The next Parliament of Charles I is referred to as the Long Parliament. Now, I'll tell you why it was called the Long Parliament. Now, basically the king was forced to summon this Parliament in 1640, once again over problems with Scotland. Now, this Parliament was very smart. They made, put forth certain conditions before the king. They took a vote that the king should not shut them down, come what may, and the king would not be able to question their decisions over anything. Now, since the king was hard pressed, for information, the king was hard pressed for any kind of support from the Parliament, he agreed, and this Parliament basically lasted for 20 years. However, during these 20 years, it was not easy sailing for the king as well as the Parliament. There were several quarrels that ensued between the two. Once again, over issues like control of the army, curtailing of the powers of the king, not giving the king enough of money to run his affairs. And to make matters worse, a civil war also broke out in 1642, and this was within this long parliament. Now, in this civil war, basically, the parliament gained an upper hand over Charles I because Charles I tried to use this civil war in order to win back certain members of the parliament onto his side. So there was a rift now that was created in the parliament, and there was a kind of a civil war that broke out, which broke out against the king. And in this civil war, as I said, the parliament was able to gain an upper hand over Charles I. He was defeated by the group called the Roundheads, led by Oliver Cromwell. He was handed over to a special court for trial. Now, being a proud man that he was, he refused to plead guilty and he was condemned for treason. Finally, he was executed at Whitehall in the year 1649 in front of a great crowd of people. For further references, students, on what I have done, please refer to the books that you see here. Arun Bhattacharjee, he has two books. One is called World Revolutions and the other is The History of Europe. Also very good books for information on this subtopic is History of Europe by B.V. Rao, as well as History of World Civilization by N. Jaipalan.